I took Moscow, but it was the biggest mistake of my life. I lost most of my army, but we'll get to that later.
Chapter 1: The Boy from Corsica. At the end of the 18th century, no one could have imagined that a thin boy from a distant Mediterranean island would one day hold the fate of Europe in his hands. On August 15, 1769, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born in the city of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. His family belonged to the lower ranks of the nobility. They had a title, but very little money. The Bonaparte family lived modestly and often struggled to support their large household. Corsica itself was going through difficult times. The island had only recently become part of France, and many people were unhappy with the change. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was among those cared deeply about the future of Corsica. From an early age, Napoleon grew up hearing discussions about freedom, politics, and power. As a child, Napoleon was stubborn, ambitious, and determined. He was not particularly strong, and other children sometimes mocked him because of his Corsican accent. But instead of giving up, he used every insult as motivation to become stronger. While many children spent their days playing games, Napoleon preferred reading books about famous generals and great rulers. He admired people who had changed history through courage, intelligence, and determination. Even as a young boy, he imagined himself leading armies and winning great battles. Few people took these dreams seriously. To most of his neighbors, he was simply a poor boy from a small island with little chance of achieving greatness. But Napoleon saw the world differently. Every obstacle became a challenge. Every difficulty became an opportunity. Deep inside, he believed he was destined for something greater. As the years passed, his ambitions continued to grow. Soon, he would leave Corsica and travel to France. There, he would face new struggles, new enemies, and new opportunities. No one knew it yet, but the journey of one of history's most famous leaders had just begun. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 3: The French Revolution. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, shaking France to its core. The monarchy was losing control, riots spread through the streets, and the nation was plunged into uncertainty. While many people feared the chaos, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte saw an opportunity. As France fought both internal enemies and foreign powers, Napoleon's talent began to stand out. In 1793, during the siege of Toulon, he developed a bold artillery strategy that helped French forces recapture the city from royalist rebels and their British allies. The victory was decisive and brought Napoleon national recognition. For the first time, France saw him not just as an officer, but as a military genius destined for greater things. Chapter 4: Rise of the General. Napoleon's true fame came during the Italian campaign of 1796. Given command of a poorly supplied army, he faced enemies with superior numbers and resources. Despite shortages of men, food, and equipment, Napoleon achieved victory after victory. His bold decisions and rapid maneuvers forced his opponents into retreat. His soldiers admired their young commander and were willing to follow him into the most dangerous battles. Soon, all of France was talking about a new military genius whose name was becoming known throughout Europe. Chapter 5: The Egyptian Expedition. In 1798, Napoleon launched an expedition to Egypt. His goal was to strike at British interests and expand French influence in the Middle East. The French army achieved several early successes. During the famous Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon's forces defeated their opponents and strengthened French control over the region. However, the campaign proved far more difficult than expected. The British Navy destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, leaving Napoleon's army in an increasingly difficult position. Realizing the situation was worsening, Napoleon left Egypt and returned to France. There, new opportunities and even greater ambitions awaited him. Chapter 6: Seizure of Power. By the late 1790s, France remained trapped in political crisis. The government was losing public support, and the struggle for power was becoming increasingly intense. Many French citizens were tired of instability and were looking for a strong leader capable of restoring order. In 1799, Napoleon carried out a coup d'état known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. As a result, he became first consul of France and gained nearly unlimited authority. Although France officially remained a republic, Napoleon had become the most powerful man in the country. His rise to the top was nearly complete. Chapter 7: Emperor of France. In 1804, Napoleon took the next step toward absolute power. After years of victories and political reforms, he decided to secure his position forever. On December 2, 1804, a grand coronation ceremony was held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The event was attended by France's highest officials, military leaders, and Pope Pius VII. However, at the most important moment, Napoleon made a shocking gesture. Instead of allowing the Pope to place the crown on his head, he took the crown himself and crowned himself Emperor of France. The act sent a powerful message across Europe. Chapter 8: Master of Europe. After his coronation, Napoleon continued expanding his influence across Europe. His armies were considered among the strongest in the world, and his enemies suffered defeat after defeat. His most famous victory came on December 2, 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz. The French army faced the combined forces of the Russian and Austrian empires. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon used brilliant tactics and achieved a decisive victory over the Allied armies. The Battle of Austerlitz became known as one of the greatest military victories in history. At cet moment ne pouvait power, nearly all of Europe respected and feared the strength of the French Empire. Chapter 9: The Fatal Mistake. After years of victories, the French Empire had grown to an enormous size. However, the larger the empire became, the harder it was to control. Britain remained Napoleon's greatest enemy. Unable to defeat the British at sea, he decided to attack their economy instead. Napoleon introduced the continental system, forbidding European nations from trading with Britain. But the policy created growing resentment even among France's allies. Many countries suffered economic losses and became increasingly frustrated with Napoleon's demands. Gradually, a new coalition began to form against France. While Napoleon celebrated his past victories, Europe was preparing for another great struggle. Chapter 10: The Invasion of Russia. By 1812, Napoleon controlled most of Europe. Confident that no army could stop him, he launched the largest military campaign of his life against the Russian Empire. More than 500,000 soldiers of the Grande Army crossed the border into Russia. Napoleon expected a quick victory that would force Russia back under his control. However, the Russian army refused to give him the decisive battle he wanted. Instead, they retreated deeper into the country, destroying supplies and leaving empty lands behind. As the French army advanced, the distances grew longer and the supply lines became weaker. Yet Napoleon continued marching toward Moscow. In September 1812, the French finally entered the city, but Moscow was nearly empty. Soon, massive fires spread through the streets, destroying much of the city. Napoleon had reached Moscow, but he had not won the war. When the harsh Russian winter arrived, the French army was forced to retreat. Freezing temperatures, hunger, disease, and constant attacks devastated the Grande Army. The invasion of Russia became the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Chapter 11: The Fall of the Emperor. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon's position weakened dramatically. His army had suffered enormous losses, and the enemies of France saw an opportunity to strike back. Soon, the major powers of Europe united against him. Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain formed a new coalition and launched a campaign against the French Empire. Despite his military genius, Napoleon could no longer replace his experienced soldiers. His armies suffered defeat after defeat as the Allies advanced toward Paris. In 1814, coalition forces entered France. Realizing that further resistance was impossible, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. The former emperor was exiled to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. It seemed that his story had finally come to an end. Chapter 12: The 100 Days. After his exile to the island of Elba, many believed that Napoleon's era had come to an end forever. However, the former emperor had no intention of giving up. In February 1815, Napoleon secretly escaped from Elba and landed in southern France. The government sent troops to stop him, but something unexpected happened. The soldiers sent to arrest Napoleon instead joined his side. His popularity among the army remained enormous. As he marched toward Paris, more and more people rallied behind him. King Louis XVIII fled the capital, and Napoleon returned to power without firing a single shot. This period became known as the 100 Days, but across Europe, preparations were already underway for the final battle against the French Emperor. Chapter 13: Waterloo. After Napoleon returned to power, the European powers immediately prepared for war once again. They had no intention of allowing him to reshape Europe a second time. Knowing that time was running out, Napoleon decided to strike first and defeat the Allied armies before they could unite. On June 18, 1815, near the small Belgian town of Waterloo, one of the most famous battles in history began. The fighting lasted throughout the day. The French army fought fiercely, but the coalition forces held their ground. Later, Prussian troops arrived on the battlefield and changed the course of the battle. By evening, it was clear that Napoleon had been defeated. His army was shattered, and his hopes of restoring the empire were gone forever. Waterloo became the final battle of one of history's greatest military commanders. Chapter Verlass Island. After his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's fate was finally sealed. The European powers were no longer willing to risk his return to power. This time, he was sent much farther away than Elba. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a small and remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This time, he was sent much farther away than Elba. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a small and remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Separated from Europe and political life, the former emperor spent his days under constant British supervision. On Island he often reflected on the triumph at Austerlitz, his coronation, the invasion of Russia, and the disastrous defeat at Waterloo. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena at the age of 51. Thus ended the life of a man who changed the history of Europe and became one of the most famous figures in world history. More than 200 years have passed since the death of Napoleon Bonaparte. His empire disappeared, his armies faded into history, and the battlefields of his greatest victories have long since fallen silent. Yet, the name Napoleon lives on. Millions of people still study his life, debate his decisions, and admire the scale of his ambition and achievements. In Paris, his remains rest beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, while monuments, museums, and historical landmarks continue to tell the story of the man who changed Europe forever. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, a military genius and visionary reformer. But one fact remains undeniable. Napoleon Bonaparte became one of the most famous and influential figures in human history.